Thank you for coming today. My name is Martha Saavedra. I'm with the Center for African Studies, and I have a few housekeeping things. First, as you probably know, you can only have bottled water in here. And in between this panel and the film, we need to clear the theater and take care of some setting up business, and then have people come back in. So you got a ticket to come in, which was to make sure that the count was correct. The fire marshal governs this room very carefully, so we can only let so many people in. So when it's time to come back for the movie, you have to get a new ticket. So unfortunately, you cannot leave your belongings in here and get the same seat necessarily, and you will have to exit and then come back for the film. We apologize for that, but that's what we have to do. So the doors for the film will open again at 7:10. You can come a little bit earlier to make sure you get a ticket. But again, I just want to make sure that everybody knows we're going to have to leave the theater and then come back before the movie. Then I would also, we are going to be filming this, and it'll be on the UC Berkeley events channel sometime in about a week or so you can look for it there. We also will hand some things out so you have the URL for that. We would also like to make sure that everybody turns off your mobile so the sounds don't distract us while we go through this panel rather quickly. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Martha. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Watts, and I'll be moderating this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to one of the 50th anniversary celebrations of free speech, obviously, and we're here this afternoon to, as it were, revisit the anti-Apartheid movement and the divestment movement, and to maybe draw some parallels with the free speech movement and, in fact, other divestment movements that are currently afoot on campus. I mean, one of the things to say right up front, of course, is that perhaps compared to the anti-war movement and compared to the free speech movement, the anti-Apartheid movement has less visibility. It's certainly, at least in my experience, among the current generation of students, it's something which is not fully understood, and very little is actually, I think, remembered about the nature of those struggles, the political alliances involved on and off campus, the political violence, the role of the regents and the university administrators. Back then, if you remember, the chancellor was Michael Hayman and UC President David Gardner. And in fact, the struggles over what divestment was to mean. All of these things, it seems to me, are central. They'll be central to what we'll be talking about this afternoon. And yet it's relatively, if not invisible, I don't think it's fully appreciated. It was, after all, Troy Duster, some of you will know Troy, longtime sociology professor on this campus, who said at the time, 1985, that in his opinion, the anti-apartheid and divestment movement was the most compelling activism at Berkeley ever, quote unquote. So it's a hugely important story, and hopefully, even though there's not an oral history, I know one of our speakers, Vincent, has been teaching about this issue and trying to put together an oral history, but I hope at least our discussion this afternoon will contribute to that. Before I go on, let me just express a vote of thanks to Martha from the African Studies Center and Professor Ugo Nwegi, the director of the African Studies Center, for helping this, and of course our sponsor. The Chancellor did kick up some dough to bring these wonderful people around here today, so we're in their debt. Let me, before I introduce the speakers, and incidentally, I'm going to be unbelievably brief. I'm not going to do justice to any of these characters because you're here to hear them and not me. But before I do that, can I just frame the conversation in some way? Particularly for some of you, maybe, I know, I can see many of you are gray hairs like me, but there's some younger people here who may not have even been alive in the early 1980s. So let me just frame, if I can, in the following way. One, even though we'll be dealing with a lot of events that occurred on campus and off campus between really 84 and 86, the final divestment decision, as you'll remember, was made in the fall of 86. I'll talk about that in just a second. But let's not forget, of course, that the movement had a much deeper history. Obviously, the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King himself was talking about South Africa in '62. SDS, we have a former president here, Todd Gitlin, who gave an address in New York in '65 on divestment. The British elections actually involved the sanctions movement in '64. Let me remind you, too, that Ron Dellums, our Ron Dellums, introduced a non-binding investment resolution in Congress. Then, and subsequently for many years after, the local California Assembly introduced a divestment bill in '73. It was defeated. UC Academic Senate did likewise in '76. You'll remember there was a labouring community stop banking on apartheid movement, hugely important, launched in 77. Cesar Chavez talked on campus to a 5,000-strong rally in 1978. And not least, of course, the longshoremen in 84, in that hugely important set of decisions in the San Francisco and Oakland docks refusing to unload ships from South Africa. All of this is part of that deeper and longer history, point one. Point two, it was a global movement. Obviously, you know that, but it needs to be asserted that then we were all part of that global movement. Three, the US divestment movement, and particularly the divestiture from Berkeley, was hugely important. It was, as you know, in '96, the largest institutional investment period at the time. But it wasn't the first. Michigan State actually divested in 1977. The decision was subsequently overturned by the courts, but it doesn't alter the fact that there was, in fact, a series of activities in the 70s on and off campus. And let me just remind you that, in fact, the issue of divestment at the regential level, at the regents, first came up in 73. It was rejected. Right? In 74, there was a petition to the regents where at least it was considered. Right? There was a huge petition and student activism in 77 over divestment, also rejected by the regents. Fourth point, of course, the fact that the 80s, that period, early 80s and 84 to 86 in particular, is so important for our discussion, is a reflection of events in and around Southern Africa at the time. Township politics, growing militancy, the radical role of South Africa in destabilizing Southern Africa, most especially in Mozambique and Angola, which was highly criticized in the international community. And of course, the decision in 1984 by the National Party to reform the Constitution. All of this was part of why this energy suddenly was released in the early 1980s. And last but not least, let me just say, of course, that there were multiple actors in and around Berkeley who were involved, and we'll have various representatives of those movements here. Campaign Against Apartheid, United People of Color, the Faculty Coalition for Full Divestment, both on the Berkeley campus and UC system-wide. The Graduate Assembly, ASUC. There was a multiplicity of actors not necessarily on the same page at all. So that's a type of framing for you. And let me just, in the interest of a couple of dates, just remind you that the movement particularly began in the fall, on campus, in the fall of 1984. There were arrests and so on, triggered in part by the longshoremen that I talked about. That gained a lot of energy in the spring of 1985. There was a rally on campus led by Gus Newport and Maxine Waters in April. That produced a series of arrests. Sit-ins around University Hall. There was a huge boycott. 10,000 students boycotted classes on April 17th. A rally in Harmon Gym at which one of our speakers gave an electrifying talk. UPC launched their sunrise shutdown in May. Bishop Tutu speaks in May also. A proposal to divest was brought to the regents in May of 1985. They deferred the decision until June. Willie Brown then presented to the regents a divestment program. This is Willie Brown. So, of course, it was actually the faculty divestment program that was, not that you'd know it, but in actual fact, it was turned down. Okay. And then in the following fall, there was a series of activities restarting mobilization. A bunch of people were arrested in November 1985. In 1986, in February, the treasurer of the UC system releases their financial report. It said that it would be a disaster to divest. That then triggered the shanty movement, which you all remember if you were around at that time, a series of shanties that were violently removed by the police on April 3rd. There was a series of decisions to rebuild and so on. The final decision came in July 1918, where Governor Duke Majan, for reasons that are not clear to me, but perhaps having to do with his re-election bid, suddenly recommended to the regents, in fact, that they divest. They voted, they did, and then a bill 134 by Maxine Waters, which added to the $3 billion of university divestments, the teachers and public employees funds, which collectively amounted to $11 billion, largest institutional divestment. Sorry to go so quickly, but maybe for those of you who don't have a frame to put those things in, that might help a little bit. Okay, so let me then immediately turn to the speakers. We conferred yesterday. We agreed that we would speak for no more than 8 minutes. I will flag. And I'm not going to say a great deal about each of them, as I mentioned before, because you're not here to speak to me. So let me introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Firstly, Gay Seidman, Professor of Sociology at Wisconsin-Madison. spent a good part of her childhood in South and Southern Africa. She attended Harvard. She was involved in the anti-Apartheid movement there. After teaching and working in Southern Africa, she came to Berkeley in '84 for a master's. And then when she came back from Africa after a subsequent visit, became centrally involved and was a person who gave, as I mentioned, that electrifying speech in Harman in the spring of 1985. She was a central player along with Pedro Nogueira, representing the Graduate Assembly, who incidentally very much wanted to be here. He's a professor at NYU. Unfortunately, he could not be here. And she's played a central role in that movement. Second speaker, Nancy Skinner, California State Assembly member, 15th District in the East Bay. She was educated, bachelor's, master's level on the Berkeley campus. ASUC Academic Affairs Vice President. She was one of the co-founders of the Graduate Student Instructors Union, centrally involved too in the South African divestment campaign. She was one of the people, leading person who began the sit-ins and instigated the process by which celebrities who happened to be in town, passing through town, Whoopi Goldberg, whoever was available, invited them to be arrested, which they were, and she was a central player in that. Third speaker, Tim Kingston, undergraduate. He's currently a Bay Area journalist and activist, active in the movement in the 1980s. Tim, there he is. Third person on the left with the duct tape. Looking a lot, not too different from actually that he looks right now. Ageless, in short. In any case, he was centrally involved as an undergraduate. Fourthly, Andrea Pritchett. Many of you will know Andrea as a Bay Area person because she co-founded Copwatch in 1990, a nationally known organization holding police accountable, but she was an undergraduate at Cal in the early 80s, involved in the campaign against apartheid, and centrally involved in many of these activities, particularly in 1985 that I just talked about, and subsequently traveled and lived and worked in South and Southern Africa thereafter. Ricky Vincent was an undergraduate in 1980s too, one of the co-founding members of the anti-Apartheid group United People for Color in 1984. He was the media contact and publicity person, engaged in a day-to-day actions during this period. He's an author, educator. He's currently teaching a course and has taught courses on the anti-Apartheid movement on campus, and probably many of you know him from his role on KPFA. Finally, am I missing anyone? I am. Todd, thank you. God forbid. Todd Gitlin. You'll know Todd, longtime faculty member on this campus. He's currently professor of journalism and sociology and chair of the PhD program in communications at Columbia. Of course, he's written extensively, was former president of SDS. He was involved in anti-nuclear protests in the 60s, anti-war movement in the 60s and 70s, and so on. He's written about the New Left, about the media in particular. His recent book is on Occupy Nation. He was a member of the Faculty Divestment Committee, along with Ken Simmons, Leon Wolfsey, Michael Reich, myself, the whole group of people who were active at that time. Last but not least, we have an undergraduate representative here, Victoria Fernandez. And I invited her along because, of course, this divestment issue is not unrelated to current and ongoing divestment struggles on this campus. The Graduate Student Union voted on BDS with regard to, in the summer, I gather. Zach, am I right? Is that correct? UAW 2865, the Graduate Student Union, on the Israeli occupation. And in relation to that divestment movement, Victoria here has been centrally involved in the fossil fuels, divest from fossil fuels campaign. So that, in short, is the layout here. Let me invite the first speaker, who's going to have to come up here because she's got a PowerPoint. And we're going to try to keep it to roughly 8 minutes per speaker. I will get very animated and wave this 1-minute thing from the front here when people have had their time, and then we'll turn to questions. Yay, Seidman.
So, at the risk of correcting Michael's very generous introduction to me, I have to say I did not grow up in South Africa. I grew up in Ghana and Nigeria and Tanzania, and I say this partly because I want to make it really clear I grew up in the anti-Apartheid movement, in a sense, because my parents were American lefties who were very involved in the anti-Apartheid movement from the time I was born. And so what I want to talk about is actually the logic of the anti-Apartheid movement as emerged over time, because I knew that all the other speakers were going to focus on Berkeley particularly, and I wanted to give you some of the context for those of you who weren't aware of how the anti-Apartheid emerged over time. Okay, so 1960, the Sharpeville massacre, 64 people were killed, they were shot in the back by the South African police. I think at that point, anti-apartheid activists around the world, including my parents, but called on the world to put sanctions on South Africa. South Africa was clearly, the rest of the world was moving towards a sort of post-colonial world. The winds of change were sweeping across Africa, as Macmillan said, but in South Africa, the white minority was imposing, was protecting white supremacy. From the very beginning, the ANC and other parties in South Africa called for economic sanctions, and they were absolutely ignored by South Africa's Western allies because, of course, as late as 1981, Reagan was telling us that those minerals, this country is strategically important, it's our ally in the Cold War. There was no way that the Western allies were going to cut ties with South Africa. So for those of us in the anti-apartheid movement, trying to figure out a way to mobilize support for a new kind of policy towards South Africa took 30 years. I think it's really easy to forget, in retrospect, how normalized discussions of South Africa were in the 1960s and how hard it was to get people to think of what was going on there as so extreme that it required a different kind of response, especially in the context of really high profits. American and European investments in South Africa expanded during the period in which the anti-apartheid movement was calling for sanctions. The business of business is business. It's profits. And the argument that somehow we should impose economic sanctions on a country where, as Fortune said, profits are great and problems are small, it just wasn't happening. And I think it's really easy to forget how comfortable private capital was with investing in South Africa. Throughout the 1960s, American business leaders argued that their main goal was to produce higher dividends for their shareholders. It wasn't about morals. Milton Friedman, the famous economist, said there's only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And I think for the anti-apartheid movement, that kind of understanding of what business was one of the biggest challenges that faced any effort to cut ties with South Africa. A sanctions movement required acting against the sort of profit motive of capitalism, and that wasn't happening. It's important to remember, I think, that this was also going on at a time when American companies were increasingly investing overseas. So some of this debate was about what role American businesses would have internationally and how you could control them. For people like Friedman, as long as companies followed the rules of the countries that they're in, there was nothing that anyone at home could do about it. But if you believed that business should follow the rules, I think South Africa presented a special challenge, because what we often forget is that apartheid was an institutionalized form of white supremacy in which apartheid laws systematically designated about 87% of the country for whites only. Blacks, who were 80 to 90% of the population, were restricted to 13% of the land area. Blacks couldn't vote. They faced explicit barriers to equality in education, in housing, and at work. Intermarriage was illegal, as was actually interracial sex, although that was rarely enforced. The apartheid laws enforced a racialized migrant labor system that meant that workers who didn't have the right passes couldn't work in white designated areas, and if they did have the passes, they had to live in single-sex hostels and send remittances back to their families. So by Friedman's dictum, businesses that limited their goals to profit-seeking within the rules could do very well in South Africa, but they would be enforcing a system of racial hierarchy and white supremacy by definition. It made South Africa a really different case from the others, and that was the job of the anti-apartheid movement, to show that business as usual is not okay. It was tough. Over the 1960s, the anti-apartheid movement called for, weaken the regime militarily, stop supplying arms, stop investing, stop giving bank loans to the government. Actually, Chase Manhattan was one of the major support after the Sharpeville massacre, when capital fled briefly from South Africa. Chase Manhattan shored up the government. Todd was one of the people who led a protest in I don't think this is not actually a picture of the protest Todd was at. I think it's a year later, but one of the very early protests SDS was involved in. However, SDS turned its attention fairly quickly to another conflict. You know that war in Vietnam was kind of attention grabbing, so they kind of turned their attention elsewhere. But a handful of religious students in the New York area, together with the American Committee on Africa, began to suggest that began to talk about what the moral responsibility was of investors. Could church denominations continue to invest in something as immoral as apartheid? By the late 1960s, there was a growing discussion among a bunch of denominations saying, you know, maybe the moral and ethical obligations of church denominations as shareholders require them to at least put forward shareholder resolutions calling for divestments, if not to sell their shares. So over the late 60s, early 1970s, right around the time Fortune is saying profits are great, it's all good, some major church denominations began to actively consider what they needed to do to cut their ties with South Africa. From the point of view of anti-apartheid activists, this became a brilliant strategy because it forced Americans to think about the links between their day-to-day lives and a place that was really far away, that they knew not much about, that they had no direct impact on. It began to be a way to get people to start talking about South Africa. In a sense, it changed the conversation to say, it's not okay to invest in a place where profits are made through a system of enforced white supremacy. I have to say, for those of us who were active in it this early, you know, by the early 1970s, it was a pretty hopeless campaign. Most serious anti-apartheid activists in the early 1970s did not believe that they would ever get any major institutions to invest. It was a way to start the conversation. And I think divestment movements today should remember this. Jennifer Davis always said all she wanted to do was to get people to think about the ethics of investing in a place like this as a way to force a policy change at the national level. Nobody actually expected divestment to happen, but if you could get Americans to feel that there was a link, if you could get them to begin stigmatizing certain kinds of behavior, it might change behavior in the long run. I would say that that would have continued to be the case if events in South Africa hadn't changed. And I think it's a very important thing to remember. The anti-apartheid movement, as Michael said, rose and fell with activism in South Africa. The 1976 students' uprising in Soweto and the death of hundreds, possibly thousands of students who were demanding English as a medium of instruction shocked people around the world. Watching those pictures on your TV screen night after night made students all over the world start thinking they wanted to do something. And I was in my undergraduate institution at the time. There were about 4 of us who were interested in anti-apartheid stuff that we would meet regularly. After the Soweto uprising, people were like pouring into our meetings, and we ended up with a huge mobilization on campus demanding investment, like many other campuses. It was a place, the divestment movement gave students on campuses a way to express their outrage at what they were seeing all the time. And perhaps, particularly in the United States, a way to talk about race and their outrage at racism more broadly in a perhaps less confrontational way. So by the late 1970s, there were demonstrations all over the United States. That it ebbed and rose with activism in South Africa. The late 1970s, there was a lot of activism, disappeared, and then, as Michael said, with the 1984 campaign around the new constitution in South Africa and the rise of a campaign known as the ANC's campaign to make the townships ungovernable, together with the South African labor movement, which was extremely militant by the mid-1980s, there was a huge increase in interest. There was actually a huge increase in funerals, and it was these funerals night after night on international TV, I think, really made people begin to say they can't take it anymore. And so by the mid-1980s, there are divestment movements on campuses, in churches, municipalities, pension funds, unions, a real stigmatization of certain kinds of investments. There were debates. There were some people who said, oh, you could get companies to support a code of conduct like the Sullivan Code. You could get companies to say that they'll integrate their canteens or integrate their workplace. They'll do affirmative action for workers. But for me, as an anti-apartheid activist, it wasn't so much about whether they sold the stock. It was about the growing pressure in grassroots communities, in different kinds of constituencies around the country, to make people think about apartheid and to put pressure on their politicians to impose national sanctions, which is what happened. Eventually, even Leon Sullivan said the Sullivan principles aren't working. By 1986, Congress overrode Reagan's veto and imposed sanctions on South Africa. The Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in September 1986 didn't go far enough, wasn't good enough, but absolutely changed politics in South Africa. I think people today, white politicians in particular, will pretend that the sanctions and the divestment movement didn't have an impact. It had a huge impact on politics in South Africa. White businessmen knew that they were increasingly isolated. They could not continue with business as usual. Sorry, that's not a phrase I meant to be using. But things things had to change. So, one part of this I want to just end with. I, coming from Wisconsin, really hate the American Legislative Exchange Council, but they were prescient, and I recently learned that they led the anti-divestment campaign among corporations in the early 1980s, which I had never known. And their argument was prescient because what they argued was that South Africa is not going to be the last time people understand that by getting corporate executives to realize it's not worth their while to continue in a particular kind of investment, they're going to change their ways. In stigmatizing investments in South Africa, we redefined business as usual. And I think ALEC understood, working together with the South African government and lobbyists, they were bad guys even then, they understood that this was a strategy that would effectively corral capital in ways that I think we didn't realize as anti-apartheid activists, but has become increasingly important. I think that the repetition by campaigns today on other issues reflects a similar vision that somehow, as grassroots constituencies, we need to be able to say to corporations, you can't do this. And if governments won't regulate or can't regulate internationally, then we have to do it through mobilizing communities and demanding a change. Thank you. Oh, I'm supposed to do something else, but I don't know what.
Hi, I'm Nancy Skinner, and I'm next on this panel. And I'm glad that Gay brought up ALEC. This is a little side note that ALEC is still alive and well. And as a legislator, very few of my colleagues in the California legislature attend their meetings. Well, they often don't have their own meetings. What they do is permeate entities like the National League of Cities, and not cities, excuse me, the National Association of State Legislators. They permeate those kinds of organizations and then provide legislators in state governments all across the country with model laws. So much of the phony fracking disclosure laws that you see are theirs, or now they're funding, and now they're currently funded by the Koch brothers. I don't know who they were funded by back then, but they're currently waging a whole effort to try to kill off any kind of renewable energy legislation in states across the country. But that's ALEC. All right. Now, my contribution to this discussion. I came to Berkeley in 1972 as an undergrad to go to school, and I first encountered the discussion of South African anti-apartheid and also divestment, though mostly when I first encountered it was really couched in anti-apartheid and not yet divestment, was in pre-1977, and it wasn't from campus at all, but in fact it was from, I got involved with a community-based electoral organization, Berkeley Citizens Action, and BCA had been, well, prior to its name of BCA, it had been called the April Coalition, was the electoral organization that supported John George, who was the first African-American supervisor in Alameda County, Ron Dellums when he went to Congress, and other progressive elected officials in the area. And the organization would have these monthly meetings, and people would bring topics, and there was a lot of faith-based church organizing around anti-apartheid. And John George, our county supervisor, was very involved in that. And so he brought, so I got introduced to it by going to those meetings, and there was a whole stop banking effort. Pull your money out of these certain banks. And there was, at the same time, the BCA elected officials in the city of Berkeley were trying to get the city of Berkeley to pull their money out of, first out of the banks, later out of investments. So it was 1977 that I was first aware of some campus activity. And the organization, at least the lead organization at that point, and there were others, but was SURGE, Students for Economic and Racial Justice. And so I participated in some of the actions. There was one at California Hall, there was one at Wheeler, there were various. And in a couple of them, both in 77 and 78, there were a number of students got arrested. At one point, 56 students, the other, and this was at Cal, and another one, I forget how many. At Santa Cruz, 200 students were arrested. But anyway, when I say our, I'm now speaking then as the student activist part of it, we were, I don't know if we hadn't really planned for arrests, and while we quickly got good legal representation right after, and I was not one of the people arrested, the university came down really hard on the students who were part of that demonstration. And many of the students that were arrested were then suspended, and they were not allowed on campus. They weren't expelled, so they eventually were able to come back and get their degrees, but it really affected, the university came down hard. So what happened is it really suppressed our building of that movement on the campus at that time because of how heavy-handed not only the university, but even Alameda County at that point in terms of the DA actually bringing charges. So anyway, what happened to me is that I started thinking about this, and I remembered from what I had read about like the FSM is that initially that also had happened, say around People's Park, around FSM, around different of the student activism here at Cal, and that eventually the student organizers got more and more sophisticated and would have a lot of community partners and would try to influence, say, the DA and such, so there wouldn't be the pressing of charges, would try to, they would do a lot of things so that there could still be the protests and the direct action with, anyway, but whatever, just more sophisticated in the organizing of it. So I started being obsessed with thinking about, all right, how can we bring some of those former student activists to campus to pass that knowledge on or share lessons learned, not that they're the smartest, but whatever, with current student activists. So I went on this quest. Well, first I read Kirkpatrick's book about SDS. And anyway, then I realized that a whole lot of these folks actually lived here in the East Bay. So Al Haber, one of the founders of SDS, happened to live in Oakland or Berkeley. And Michael Rossman, who FSM, one of the main students involved in FSM, lived here. So I started to call them up and meet them, and actually, well, ended up renting my. Michael Rossman was my landlord for I don't know, maybe 10 years. So I started getting very involved with these former student activists, and we kept trying to. We had a few little events where we would bring current student activists together with the former, but it was all very informal. And then I ended up being hired by the Graduate Assembly to be their executive director in 1981. And so I was a student, but I was also the full-time person there. And Robbie Cohen was a history graduate student who was obsessed with the student movement also. And we got to know each other, and he reminded me at a certain point, he said, hey, Nancy, the 20th anniversary of the free speech movement is 1984. So why don't we have the GA, and why don't we host a big event? And I said, okay, as long as the focus of the event could be bringing former activists to campus to share with the student activists to do that lessons learned. So in the process, that year, so this is now the 84-85 school year, Pedro Noguera was the chair of the GA. So, and we had a lot of staff, Teresa Cordova, I believe, was our coordinator of minorities and women in color. I forget that project, but anyway, she was one of the staff. There were lots of folks that were very involved in this who were either staff of the GA as graduate students or were active graduate students. So anyway, we realized that we didn't just want FSM to be the focus. We used the 20th anniversary of FSM, but we brought back people from the Third World Strike. We brought people from People's Park. We brought student activists from all the different, so we were covering the whole gamut. And then, as now, race is always an issue. And so we were very careful in designing the conversations, so we dealt with that. Anyway, so we had this huge event, and which we brought Mario Savio back for the first time, huge rally and all. And in the course of that, the GA decided, okay, now how do we carry that on? And we decided 3 focuses. One was divestment. One was diversification amongst the students and the faculty. We wanted better there weren't enough people of color in the students and the faculty on the campus. So that was our second priority, and then I forget what our third was. But we then began to do organizing around that. And I did not organize the sit-in when the sit-in occurred. So now we're in the winter semester of '85. And we were launching the divestment activities. There were lots of groups doing it, but when it got fully launched and all the activity was going on, we realized, the GA, that we wanted to continue to bring that kind of sophistication to, let's say, the purpose was anti-Apartheid. That's the goal. That was the goal. Divestment was a strategy towards the goal. So we wanted to continue to really help people understand all of that. But anyway, we organized the celebrity arrests. We did lots more. And my time is up. But the thing I wanted to also add to this conversation is that we were also, we being a group of us at the GA, which we had many different organizations that we were also part of, we were very conscious about a strategy of identifying powerful entities that that had resources that we could use to help support and be a bedrock to the organizing we were doing. So that is one of the reasons we had the presence we had at the GA. It's one of the reasons that then Pedro ran for ASUC president that next year, because the ASUC at that point was an independent corporation run by the students with lots of money that could be utilized for the type of activism that we were basically doing and supporting. So I wanted to share that, as it was a very explicit strategy, our roles in various entities and organizations.
Right. I'm going to give a very personal account of one activist's involvement as a divestment activist. I don't know how representative I am, but it's a decent story. To me, the anti-Apartheid movement consisted of 2 of the best strands of American activism that existed: international solidarity movement and anti-racism. In other words, the Vietnam War and civil rights activism. I came to the anti-Apartheid movement early because I grew up in London and had become politicized as a teenager through involvement with a Trotskyite outfit called the Socialist Workers' Party, not the American one, the English one. And as a result, I was well aware that South African apartheid was kind of the perfect representation of racial corporate capitalism. And then I finished high school and moved to Orange County from Yes, it was a horrible mistake. It was in 1977, and I was desperately trying to escape to Berkeley, and I became involved in an anti-apartheid movement that was really quite successful in Irvine, in the heart of Orange County. This coincided, as much as I remember, with Soweto, the murder of Steve Biko, as well as a system-wide demand that a UC system stop investing in South Africa. While my memory is hazy, a few things stand out. One, Governor Pete Wilson was trying to get elected. We nailed him at a place where he was trolling for votes. Several hundred students got him nailed down on South Africa. He didn't say the right thing, but he was forced to say something about it. More important, we actually took over the administration building at UC Irvine for a couple of nights. That would involve at least a couple of hundred students, which I wouldn't have expected for Orange County. And finally, it was the first time the UC regents trotted out their arguments that divestment would cost the UC system way too much money. In other words, the idea was the more you invest in well, actually, go back. It would cost too much money, and constructive engagement, a phrase that we wound up hearing a lot of, was a much better way of going. In other words, if you invest more in a racist regime, it'll get better for the victims of that regime. So I finally made it to Berkeley. Reagan had just been elected king, and activists were a little despondent and really pissed off. The things that were going on, Central American solidarity activism was boiling due to the US support for the quasi-fascist regimes of El Salvador and Guatemala, and of course there was the Contras. Anti-nuclear activism had redoubled through the Livermore Action Group. There were many, many actions at Livermore. People were learning civil disobedience and were learning fairly effective organizing. What else? The one thing that I wanted to bring up is that a lot of this organizing was based on idealism rather than concrete knowledge. International solidarity work has been a template in the US, but it isn't actually affecting the people who are doing that work. In the same way, it's not community or union-based. The first time I became involved in that kind of activism was in queer activism and AIDS activism, when it really struck me home. Up until that point, it had all been international stuff, and I don't think I was alone in that. It allows for quite radicalized action, but it also means that it's not directly related to you. During that time, I was a student here. I took several classes with this guy over here, Michael Watts, and decided that my honors thesis would concentrate on UC investments in South Africa. It was supposed to be a short paper, and he sadly had a 3-ton thing dropped on his desk. At that time, I went off to London, where there was a very, very powerful and strong anti-apartheid movement, which was very deep. They had a lot of research. They had a lot of documentation, which was how I was able to do a lot of good research for this paper that I wrote. I returned to the Bay Area in about 1984. I believe this was when the Sun City album was recorded. The ANC rebellion was underway in South Africa. And in the spring of 1985, the UC administration was selling, quote, the exact same bullshit about constructive engagement and Sullivan principles that I knew was a lie. So I wound up at the KPFA studios, wrote what was essentially a screed masquerading as a news report, and this was how I wound up becoming a journalist. Side note. In '85, anti-apartheid activism, how much have I got? Anti-apartheid activism was taking off like a rocket. There were demos on campus, there was the University Hall action, constant pressure on the regents. The stuff in my thesis was used in pamphlets and documents, which I think may have had some use. And there was also a lot of other stuff going on, as other speakers have said. Reagan mined the harbors of Nicaragua. AIDS was raising its head. Jean Kirkpatrick, remember her? She got yelled down at UC Berkeley, and everyone got their panties in a knicker about that. The anti-nuclear movement was continuing, and CISPAS was extremely busy, as was the FBI was busy spying on it. So this was the backdrop to the anti-apartheid movement in Berkeley. I was no longer a student, but I was one of hundreds of students sleeping on the steps of Sproul Plaza while holding down a peon job for an evil insurance defense firm. I covered the shantytown as a reporter, missed the police attack on the shantytown because I was trying to do the news that morning. There were rallies, there was the teach-in at Harmon, there was the June Regents meeting where they voted down divestment. But the thing I want to say is we didn't give up, and we eventually won so convincingly that the UC administration now tries to make out they were on the side of the angels all along. As Ross Hammond, who some of you probably remember, extremely effective activist, said, one of the reasons it was so successful was because so many different people came at it from so many different directions and so many different politics. We were hitting them everywhere, and they didn't know where the next one would come. So I'm going to end by swiping a long quote from Steve Massover, I think is here somewhere. Quote, this year about the death of Nelson Mandela. I felt a jarring dissonance to see the UC Berkeley Chancellor of 2013 taking pride in and institutional credit for a movement that he now embraces, but that his predecessor at Berkeley, Chancellor Ira Michael Heyman, tried ruthlessly to destroy, and that then UC President David Gardner opposed on principle. The anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s, including all the thousands of Berkeley students, staff, faculty, alums, and community members who participated in it, was on the right side of history. The UC Berkeley and University of California administrations and the UC Board of Regents, in particular the UC Board of Regents, had to be shamed, badgered, and ultimately cornered into doing the right thing. They didn't yield easily. They used threats, intimidation, and the police force in their attempts to derail our movement, end quote. But they didn't. We won and forced the UC system to divest. We should celebrate this victory and be proud of. It's a lesson that other divestment movements, which will be talked about, have accurately and correctly taken to heart. Not only does a movement like that critique injustice, it delegitimizes it, which in many ways is the beginning of the end. And I hope it is the beginning of the end for other unjust, dangerous, and inhumane systems, such as corporate capitalism. I'd like to thank Lee Trampleser and Ross Hammond for their help.
Well, I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really glad to see so many members of the Campaign Against Apartheid here today. Yeah, rock on. So I'm going to talk about, I was involved. I was an undergraduate from 81 to 85, and I was here for 84 to 87 participating in protests. So, yes, of course, we in the campaign were building on the work of others who came before us and on the previous waves of activism against apartheid. And while there was activity on many fronts, the campus movement had largely dissipated by the time we were active. The role of the Campaign Against Apartheid, as we saw it, was to create on the campus a momentum of action that was aimed at directly confronting the UC about its complicity in apartheid. So in a movement as broad as the one fighting for divestment, there's many sectors that need to be mobilized, as mentioned, and each group has its role to play. Some folks are working with the legislature. Some folks are trying to get administrative support for the cause and mobilize it in that way. Our group was about taking action. Our success was in our ability to initiate situations that allowed thousands of people to participate and brought the issue of divestment into the national media, even international media, and right to the doorstep of the university president and to the regents themselves. Although our methods were sometimes controversial, we took our inspiration from the people of South Africa who were battling the apartheid regime in the townships and fighting off tanks and the South African Defense Forces with sticks and stones, and with a spirit of resistance that inspired us to act in solidarity. So by the fall of 1984, the campus, I saw no signs of the anti-apartheid movement, mostly during my 1981, I was as an undergraduate. There were stirrings in 1984, and the Campaign Against Apartheid was started in October. So there were rallies. I remember speaking at rallies where not one single person stopped to listen. I'm sure you do too. But it was happening. But the flyers were happening, and the connections to previous chapters of activism were being made. Ultimately, when the longshore workers in the end of November and the beginning of December 1984, they had that very heroic refusal to unload South African cargo. That was very inspirational for us. We decided to take action to sit in at University Hall. I think we counted 8 people who were ready to get arrested. By the time the action was over, 38 people had gotten arrested. And it signaled that there was a spirit, that there was a heart for action, that there was a fatigue, sort of a conversation fatigue, and that it was time to actually confront the university directly. In the spring of 1985, a sit-in started somewhat spontaneously, and without complete unity from all the campus groups. Eventually, it was endorsed and supported by all the major groups on campus. After being allowed to remain a week, and that was the university's mistake, they allowed us to be there for a week. We were sleeping over and living on the steps, and we were organizing 24 hours a day. On the 7th day, the university decided to sweep the steps. 158 people were arrested. But what happened was this backlash that clearly they didn't anticipate. Because what happened is I got arrested that night, turning into day. And as we left on the buses, I was very sad. I thought it's over, that was good, but it was over. But it wasn't over, it had taken hold. And so that afternoon, we heard in jail that there was a noon rally with like 4,000 to 5,000 people. Mario Savio spoke. That night when we got out of jail, and there were hundreds of people on the steps. So this was the value of direct action. The Spring Action provided an opportunity for many groups to be formed. It put pressure on organizations to lend their support and their solidarity. The faculty became more visible. The unions were speaking out more. There was a greater urgency and greater visibility. And the sit-in became a nexus, much like the Occupy protest, the Occupy movement, Occupy Oakland, where you could readily access the movement. You didn't have to already be part of a group. It was there. However, there were hundreds of arrests. There was the University Hall arrest, the celebrity arrests, as they say, the student boycotts of class, et cetera. But all of this failed to achieve divestment. So we determined that we had to keep the pressure on, that we had to escalate the situation. We had to raise it to another level. Plus, the university was no longer allowing, and you couldn't sleep over anyway because they learned their lesson. In mid-March 1986, we worked with longshore workers to create a picket line at the docks in San Francisco to stop the unloading of cargo, very similar to the pickets that are happening in Oakland right now to stop the unloading of Israeli ships from unloading their cargo. Go longshore workers. So by April of '86, we decided to create a shantytown. And to dramatize the conditions under which South Africans were living, we placed shantytowns around all the entrances of California Hall and declared that we would not move until divestment was achieved. On the first night, about 61 people were arrested. We came back. Again, we wanted to keep the pressure on. We came back within 48 hours, and there was a new shantytown. This time, however, the level of resistance to police destruction of our shantytown was very intense. Police arrested hundreds of people, injured dozens, and were met with barricades. They were met with actual resistance. They were met with rocks and bottles. The level of violence that night was a very serious escalation. It was a battle. It was a battle. And rumors circulated that if we brought that shantytown back for a third time, we would invite that it would cause the National Guard to come in. Ultimately, because for a variety of reasons, to maintain solidarity within the movement, we didn't bring the shantytown back in that same form. The actions of that night very much divided our movement. However, 3 months later, the UC voted to divest. Folks asked why were we so confrontational? You see, the campaign against apartheid was a place where students and non-students could come together, where longshore workers, where communists, where hippies, where anybody could come into the campaign. We had an office in Eshelman Hall, and it was accessible 24 hours a day. And we dared ourselves and each other to move beyond petitions and to move beyond requests and to act against apartheid. And that was our measure. Were you doing something? We were not against conversation. We were just simply not willing to have conversation become a substitute for the action that had failed to materialize after the wave of activity in the 1970s. We believed that there was a fundamental conflict within the university that could not be papered over, and that it was far more humane to interrupt a regents meeting than to be silently complicit in the brutal exploitation of 27 million South Africans. We wanted to expose the violence that is inherent in the governance of the University of California. We wanted to question and challenge the regents and their own self-serving involvement with the very companies that we were asking them to divest from. And this is why we felt justified in disrupting regents meetings, for example. To us, the university's notion of civility is simply a hollow posturing whose true purpose is to divide the reasonable protesters from the unreasonable protesters. And it's also a way of ensuring that the issue remains an academic debate rather than being exposed as a power struggle between the students and people of California who favored divestment and the corporate leaders and CEOs who actually govern the university. So we were controversial. Some people admired our boldness and the dedication to taking action against apartheid, and some faulted us for being too confrontational and for provoking police action against us. We worked with lots of other groups, but our main loyalty was always with those who were actually putting their bodies on the line and risking their safety in order to further the struggle, whether they were here or in South Africa. We were mostly students, but we worked very closely with non-students. And we didn't allow ourselves to be isolated from the community and all the rich experience and support that they have to offer. And we were very skeptical about leaders from the university. Very skeptical. We didn't allow ourselves to be lured into backroom dealings. Any dealings that we had were done out in the open in the general meeting. So at that time, there was a fundamental discontent with capitalist society that certainly exceeded the modest demand of divestment. And maybe that's why in the campaign, we never actually had a party to celebrate divestment. As the veterans of the free speech movement learned, and as we realized in the course of our struggle to take on the UC, that to take on the UC is to take on corporate America, to take on the state government, and even more every day, the federal government. The movements to divest from companies supporting fossil fuels, prisons for profit, and the occupation of Palestine will continue to clash with the profit motives of the regents until the governance structure of the university system itself has changed. And the way will be hard, but there's a huge community of support beyond the UC that is waiting for the students to lead and is certainly willing to support them. Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
So how am I supposed to follow that? But it's always great getting energized by Andrea here. I actually sought her out last year when I started up a class on the anti-Apartheid movement because what she did back in the 80s resonated with me back then. And I said, if there's anybody that I think will still bring the fire, it will be Andrea. Okay, so what I was doing in the anti-Apartheid movement, I was an undergrad back then. Like a lot of people, I was outraged by the re-election of Ronald Reagan, and I think what was happening on the national level was really lending itself to the level of organizing that was happening throughout local communities that I feel like we don't see as much today. That is kind of an interesting kind of counterpoint to that. And then in the fall, when the brothers in the Local 10 of the International Longshoremen's Warehousemen's Union, that's what it was called back then before they had genderized it. Okay. But when they did that action, a lot of us on the campus were really motivated to really look inward and find out, well, what are we doing here? We're privileged. We're on this campus, and these men were risking their careers to take a stand against racism in South Africa. So a number of us got together, and we met at Eshelman Hall, which was an interesting space for everybody to use, which they tore down, interestingly. It's interesting how a lot of the geography of campus power structure was affected by our movement, by what we did. The officers, they had to leave town because of what we were doing. And it turns out the organization that came together, the students that came together were comprised of primarily leaders of the student of color organizations that were on the campus, the MECHA, the PACE, the Filipino American organization, the Black Student Union, folks from CISPAS, the committee in solidarity with people in El Salvador. A lot of folks had come together, even though they were already engaged with the activists, the anti-racist activists, anti-colonial activists, activism they were doing. They came together specifically to respond to what was happening with the longshoremen and what was happening in South Africa. And it was an interesting coalition of people who said, you know, our issues are very important, but this issue is paramount. And so we're going to organize, and we're going to organize our constituents, which are the students of color on the UC campus, to mobilize around what was seen very early on as a target, which was divestment. The organization didn't have a name, but we met weekly and we looked at what the other groups were doing. There was a very radical component to the organization. There was folks that were in solidarity with the campaign against apartheid, that were more into engagement than folks in the campaign against apartheid. We had a really robust debate in our meetings. There was very strong leadership, Pedro Nogueira, Patricia Vatwoni, Regina Freer, Howie Pender Hughes, Michael Berry, Sherry Dunn. There were a lot of folks that had a skill set that was just remarkable. And every week we had to deal with who our constituents and who our opposition really was. We were interested first in mobilizing and educating students of color on campus. We were interested in addressing the larger community, labor unions, churches, people that the undergrads and the graduate students that were on the campus that we were connected to, their community where they came from. We were addressing the administration, and we were dealing with the other anti-apartheid organizations. And the thing was, even though we came together specifically around the issue of the anti-apartheid movement, what became clear to us was we all had an other overriding issue, and that was dealing with the racist climate on campus, the climate of racism, ignorance, and intolerance that we were getting from fellow students, fellow activists, as well as the administrators. And so we always wound up in sort of multifaceted strategies. Some of us would deal with administration and negotiation. Some of us would deal with other campus activists. Some of us would deal with educating student groups and going into dorms and classrooms and working on how we can mobilize students of color in this exploding movement that was taking place. In the spring of 1985, all these activities were taking place, and the sit-in, like you said, spontaneously emerged, and it was thrilling, it was exciting, but it was also, we saw it as not necessarily the most appealing place for the students of color that were that we were directly trying to mobilize. Some of them were the first to attend college. Some of them, weren't necessarily comfortable spending the night out on the street with a community like that. And we also were concerned that if students of color were confronted with law enforcement, they would find themselves treated differently. In many cases, sent to jail or expelled, or simply didn't have the resources to return to school if those things happened to them. So we had a lot of concerns about that, but they weren't concerns about the ideology of the event. But there were rumblings, there were misgivings. Wait, how do we endorse this? How do we support this? And it was a week after the sit-in began, we decided to fully endorse it, and Pedro Noguera, who's one of the most articulate leaders of that movement, got up and said, people have questioned whether we can support this, and he said, there's no way any free-thinking person cannot support this. And that was a change in tone for the movement that day. People ran to the steps and added their bodies to that protest, and of course that was the night that the police raided the camp. And it kind of symbolized what some of our concerns were, and that is once you get people of color involved, then you're going to get a different reaction from law enforcement. And so we always had this sort of multiple response issue we had to deal with. But it didn't stop us, and it didn't stop the movement. It exploded the movement, and things went on. It was amazing to behold the visit of Bishop Tutu, the big talk that happened in the gymnasium where everybody was chanting "Go Bears, divestment." It wasn't that bad, but Gay was brilliant at that talk, as were a lot of other people. And it seemed like there was a mass movement on the campus that had the hearts and minds of people that felt like generically injustice was bad, and also felt like it's time for capitalism to go, and this is the way to get this started. So it was interesting that we had this mix of everyone. We organized our own events in the fall, and then in the spring, we organized some of the shanty towns that, that took place, and people know about that history. But I just want to mention some of the aftermath of that, because by the second year, our protest chants went beyond apartheid, and they dealt with racism locally, racism in the community and racism in the on the UC campus. And so our target was the creation of an ethnic studies graduation requirement, which would mandate that students here have to address the question of their own cultural insensitivity and ignorance, and put that front burner. And that took 4 years and wound up being negotiated into the American cultures requirement, which still exists on this campus. And so undergraduates have that. It was sort of a compromise, so we didn't have a party for that either, but it was still, you know, a result of all the mobilization that we had, that was in place. As soon as divestment took place, we put out a press release. The next step for United People of Color was an ethnic studies graduation requirement. And that organization led to the creation of a campus political party, the CalServe organization, which is still around. So there was a lot of groundwork and a lot of activism laid then that is still taking place now, and it's time to keep it moving. Thank you.
So in the spirit of last weekend's immense climate march in New York, I want to, and elsewhere, I want to use a metaphor drawn from nature. I want to talk about cascades. The divestment movements of the 1980s were part of a cascade of change that had immense reverberations, and that whose pattern, whose sequence, I think, has some instruction for us as we think about the challenges today. You've already heard some of this, but I want to put it in somewhat different context. You had, in the 1980s, a series of civil disobedience actions. You had sit-ins daily, in which celebrities and other members of Congress participated at the South African Embassy in Washington. You had, as we've heard, actions by universities, by unions rather, and you had the divestment movements in universities. From the divestment movements at universities, including not least this one, came a wave of other actions by pension funds, by public and private, local, state. You had the turn of capital away from South Africa, which, as Gay reminded us, was actually extremely consequential in convincing the apartheid regime in South Africa that it had better evacuate. In the process, in order for this cascade to work, there had to be a lot of vectors in motion. Many of them were political in the sense of having to do with the actions of elected officials. For example, in the great divestment movement, which we had here, we had the support of a number of elected officials or members of the Board of Regents who had been appointed by Governor Jerry Brown in his first incarnation. The Lieutenant Governor Leo McCarthy was a big supporter of ours. Stanley Scheinbaum, a regent who had been appointed by Jerry Brown, was a steadfast for many years, advising us, and even at a time when Republican policy under Reagan was, I think, seriously expressed by a member of Congress from Wyoming who opposed a House resolution censuring apartheid and calling for the freedom of Nelson Mandela on the ground that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. You've probably heard of this dude, Dick Cheney. At a time when that was the dominant politics in the Republican Party, the governor of the state, George Deukmejian, was looking for a way to capitalize on sentiment, realized his his base in minority communities, so-called, people of color communities in California, was shaky. And so it happened sort of behind our backs that regents who had been really perfectly happy to see this movement go on and beat its head against the wall, actually turned, and that's how divestment was accomplished. So one lesson I think that needs to be drawn from this is that in order to win, there had to develop splits among the elites. Now, the splits came about sometimes by moments of conscience, but more often as a result of the pressure exerted by activists like some of us in this room. There were not only splits among elites that were sort of at an abstract level, a sort of political sciencey level, there were splits within families. The question of whether Nelson Mandela should be freed became an issue over which people fought at dining tables, as they did comparably in the case of the Vietnam War. So there was a cascade of opinion, a mood, and the mood change which was instrumental to the cascade that followed. Now, we've been talking here about a great movement against one of the depredations of Western civilization, which is white supremacy. I want to turn to a few words about civilization from another aspect. We collectively, everyone in this room, virtually everyone in the world, is now floating on the surface of a civilization that evolved 200, 250, 300 years ago, which derived energy from the combustion of the remnants of previous forms of life, animal and vegetable. I'm talking about fossil fuels. They're called fossil fuels for a reason. And our civilization was built on the products of those combustions and, of course, on the slavery that was integrally integrated with it. So the arguments that were raised against divestment with respect to South Africa are still, as we've heard, some of the same arguments that are addressed today. Really, the argument that was thrown in our face by the likes of University of California President David Gardner was, we like the way this civilization is running, and we don't need a bunch of rascally radicals telling us what to do. It was a vote. Those who opposed divestment in South Africa were making a vote of confidence in the workings of civilization as they had it. So they were making arguments at every level which amounted to an affirmation of their own authority, of their own legitimacy, and their revulsion against the thought that anybody might tell them what to do with the resources of the society that are, for example, invested in funds. So, for example, we heard then the argument already alluded to that the net financial effect of divestment is nil, because when you sell a stock, somebody else buys a stock, which of course is well understood, but is not the point of divestment. We heard, I was reminded earlier of this marvelous phrase, constructive engagement. They haven't rolled that one out, but the same concept is still in play now when university officials like Drew Faust at Harvard say that the mission of the university is to have conversations with the directors of corporations. These are affirmations that the institutions that are now empowered are adequate to the dimensions of the crisis. Well, they are not. And to change the fundamentals of the civilization on which are so deeply predicated on fossil fuels, we require more of this sort of cascade. We require waves. We require that the status quo be understood to be untenable. And there are signs of something coming alive here. The march was extraordinary, but I also want to mention that, again, among elites, there is something of a swerve of opinion. We have people like Michael Bloomberg and Hank Paulson who come out for a transformation in the ways in which corporations conduct themselves with respect to energy. We have the emergence of fossil-free investment funds. We have the movement toward carbon pricing. I won't go into that. We have journalists, many wising up to the fact that the point is not simply to report this drought, that hurricane, the other pipeline, but to connect the dots and show that the system of the natural world is in jeopardy all told. And the University of California regents are now lagging. So in this spirit, I want to turn it over to Victoria to tell us how to delag them.
Thanks, Todd. We're trying. So I'm Victoria. I'm a fourth year at UC Berkeley, and I'm studying environmental economics and policy and society and environment. This fossil fuel divestment campaign started, Cal, it started 3 years ago, but it started much more before that in Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. Some students, tell me if this is too loud, some students went to communities that were being impacted by mountaintop removal in West Virginia. If you don't know what that is, look into it. It's devastating to the community's air, water, and generally economic, opportunity. Debris is put into streams that people use for their water. People get cancer. It's devastating. So these students went to these communities, and they saw the decimation basically, and thought, what can we do? Students at colleges with certain privileges. And they thought, wow, okay, so our endowments that the universities have are invested in these exact same companies that are carrying out business as usual at the expense of communities around the nation, around the world. And so they looked to divest from the Filthy 15, the top 15 coal companies at the time. At UC Berkeley, we started 3 years ago with similar asks, trying to divest from coal, until it sort of became this national movement with the help of many organizations, the California Student Sustainability Coalition and 350.org, really to connect what students were talking about on campus, this idea of climate justice, and how we could all sort of work together to find this common goal. So it became that we were targeting the top 200 companies with the largest carbon reserves, because the top 200 companies have 5 times the amount of reserves that are safe to actually burn. We could cook the planet 5 times over if these companies have their way and carry out their business model as is set. And I'm just very honored to be speaking and to hear the stories of people that have, really set the precedent of the UC divesting from moral outrages and things like that. And I started out at UC Berkeley taking a lot of ethnic studies classes, which and taking the AC courses, which we wouldn't have had. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to take without this movement. And that really shaped why I jumped into fossil fuel divestment, because fossil fuel divestment is the tactic, and then the larger goal is what we're calling climate justice. So climate justice is a variety of things. It's economic justice, it's social justice, it's justice and moving away from these inequalities that these fossil fuel companies put on communities of color, communities that are low income. And so it's a solidarity tactic with those companies, or I'm sorry, with those communities. And so there's also these moral underpinnings that it's wrong to profit from the destruction of our futures, which is what UC is doing by having investments in the fossil fuel industry. And something that has really been amazing is this national sort of network, this national framework that students from across the nation are all working on this. There are 400 campuses in the United States, 500 internationally. And to give you an idea, I'm also in Fossil-Free UC, which is targeting fossil-free divestment campus, or I'm sorry, system-wide. We're at every UC except for Merced and have passed student resolutions in support of fossil fuel divestment. UC Santa Barbara has also passed a faculty academic senate resolution. So we're really looking to build our base and are seemingly, at the beginnings of these waves. I've been working on this for a year and 8 months, and it's really inspiring and encouraging to see the longevity of something like this, of being a part of something like a social movement that is moving toward, intersectional justice. And being in the trenches a little bit right now, it's very encouraging to see that there is change, and decision makers that have received benefits from these different inequalities their minds can be changed. So there's also a little bit more about our specific campaign at UC. We have the UC Regents created a task force that they decided they wanted to look into fossil fuel divestment, look at the feasibility, see what it would do to the portfolio, see what they, kind of what the consensus was. And so myself and another student from UCSC, Alden Finney, served on this task force over the summer. I was actually in DC, so it was a lot of conference calls. And they started with the financial argument and said that it was financially infeasible. They took out the entire energy sector from the portfolio, which is not what we're asking for. We're asking for the top 200 companies. But there was a lot of sort of ways to make this seem like a more insurmountable thing than it actually is. And so once they did the actual financial report and found out that divesting from fossil fuels, the top 200 companies, and even the top 100 coal companies, more specifically, even a smaller amount, would have a negligible effect on the portfolio. They moved to other sorts of reasons why we shouldn't divest. So one was implementation. That we'd lose our great external fund managers. We had them call them, and over a course of 5 years, which is what our ask is, which is forever. In investment terms, that was it wouldn't be a problem. So then they actually moved to, well, does divestment actually work? We don't see that divestment from fossil fuels would move the needle on climate change. It wouldn't address climate change. It wouldn't do anything to combat climate change, to move us away from it. And so that's where we had to do a lot of reading and a lot of history and a lot of research with the help of an Oxford study and someone by the name of Bob Massey, who wrote this huge book basically on why divestment works. Yes, and so we presented that to the task force, and they, some minds were changed. They saw that divestment can lead to, long-term financial effects from stigmatization of these companies, but there was a process that within the task force. There were a lot of sort of, as Andrea mentioned, these backdoor conversations that even ended up trying to change the recommendation of the task force that would move to the regents without the student input, which we had to raise a little uproar about to get that anti-divestment language taken out. But ultimately, I think we're still very optimistic that the UC will stand on the right side of history in this case. And one last thing I wanted to mention very quickly is our ask of reinvestment. So reinvestment in solutions, but those that are community-led and sustainable community solutions. So there's a campaign called Our Power, which is sort of doing a pilot program in Richmond, California, where there is a Chevron refinery. There was a huge explosion two years ago during the summer that sent 15,000 people to the hospital. This is just one of the communities that is burdened by the fossil fuel industry, and really looking to make investments in those communities with the decision-making power of those communities, steering the boat there. That's really what we're also looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Here's what I'm going to suggest, if this works for everyone. In the interest of time, I'm going to suggest that we take now a number of questions, provocations, interventions, maybe over the next 10 minutes or so, and then give the opportunity of the panel to respond in whatever way they feel fit, rather than going one-on-one back and forth, if that's okay with everyone. And I'm going to open up, if I can. I'll get to you by asking Nancy Poland, who should have been on the panel because she's a South African anti-Apartheid veteran who was a member of the staff of the union. And so I'd like to ask you, Nancy, if you can, to get us going. Then I'll open it up. We're going to need to mic this for the video, so we'll need to pass the mic around. I'll recognize your hands. We'll get as many questions as we can. Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Poland. I came in 1965 to Berkeley and got a job as a typist clerk. Within a few years on campus, and within a few years, a small group but growing group of office workers on the campus began a real grassroots union organizing drive. The estimate at that time was that there were about 6,000 or 7,000 on the Berkeley campus alone, 6,000 or 7,000 non-academic workers. This thing started among clerical workers, office workers, but we came into a situation where we were approached by people in the dormitories, the women who clean up in the dormitories, mostly black women who also needed assistance organizing. So we were also mostly women. We were office workers, library workers, non-professional library workers, technical workers. So it was impossible for us to organize a union without addressing issues of race and of gender. And we did that. And that began about 1967. Coming into the 70s, we have all what you've heard about, the development of movement and solidarity with South African black people and toward divestment. And we also were involved with that as early as the 70s. Our union newsletter had articles about South Africa. We affiliated with an AFL-CI union, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, AFSCME. We were AFSCME Local 1695. And the Central Labor Council was also taking some action. Richard Grew, who was the secretary-treasurer of that, actually addressed the regents on the issue of South Africa and divestment. And there was this gradual development of the anti-apartheid solidarity movement on campus. In 1983, by legislation, we got the right to collective bargaining. We did not, however, that did not mean that every worker on the campus had to join our union. So we had to keep working in a very challenging situation to grow our union. In 1984, we had the longshore workers taking the action they did in this building up of this movement, as you've heard about, which peaked in 1986. And all along, we've been organizing and having to deal, as I said, with race. We fought for affirmative action. We defended workers who were unfairly treated, who were people of color, or in many cases who were women who were not treated fairly. So at the time of the peaking of the anti-apartheid movement on campus, we had developed an anti-apartheid committee, which I co-chaired in our union. We continued to write leaflets and newspaper articles. We went to campus coalition meetings around this. We went to rallies. Some of our members got arrested, along with our brothers and sisters in the Teaching Assistants Union at University Hall. And we had our position that one of the most nervous moments in my life was having to sit at the Board of Regents meeting at the table. You were there, I remember it all so well, and tell them what our position was and how divestment was so important to do. We were there. It was our retirement funds that were invested in these awful corporations supporting apartheid, and we were very morally angry and outraged, and we were there. And it was very important to me to add that piece.
Questions in the interest of time, brevity, being succinct would be great. Liz, gentleman further up on the left.
Michael, can I just add to her comments while we do the point of Nancy's that labor was really involved, but also every community organization, every faith-based, I mean, this was well beyond the campus, and I think it was very important to point out. I'm sure all of us were kind of implying it, but just the importance of the fact that it was across every entity throughout the East Bay that was involved in this movement.
Thank you. Sir.
Yes, I'm going to give some information, but probably won't have time to make my point of the information due to request for brevity. My name is Mario, too, and I'm a progressive activist and sometimes a political commentary writer. And I just want to say that some of the still living prominent former members of the FSM have either betrayed what Mario Savio stood for, as when former leftists turned anti-Arab and anti-black liberal racist warmonger Christopher Hitchens was invited by Lynn Hollander Savio for the keynote address in the form of an interview for that year's annual Mario Savio Memorial Lecture. It was a softball interview. And Lynn also tried to prevent the two student Mario Savio Award winners themselves from challenging Hitchens' warmongering. Or they've otherwise forgotten what Mario Savio stood for when Lynn Hollander Savio, Bettina Aptheker, and about a half dozen other former FSMers got a letter published in the San Francisco Chronicle, a letter then condemning progressive protesters in Berkeley who protested Benjamin Netanyahu and the state of Israel for its decades-long brutal oppression of the indigenous Palestinian people, but not one single word in the SF Chronicle condemning Netanyahu and Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people themselves. No, I'm just making a brief statement. This, and I'm about to finish up. Sure, I understand, I'm about to finish up. This is the new anti-apartheid movement. I wrote a letter to the SF Chronicle and the Daily Planet pointing out exactly how those letter signatories also betrayed what Mario Savio stood for. You can find that letter by just Googling Joseph Anderson and Netanyahu protesters. And I just want to finally say some of the Mario Savio Memorial Lecture events have become more progressive celebrity entertainment events than a forum for serious inquiry, especially through the use of index cards where any challenging questions are omitted.
Thank you very much. Sir, I'm going to slide then to this.
Hi, my name is Ophir. I just graduated from UC Berkeley, and I was right there with Victoria starting the fossil fuel divestment campaign about a year and a half ago. Great job, Victoria, repping fossil for UC with the veterans. And I have so many questions, but I was just so struck by the repetition in history of hearing your stories, and it sounding like exactly what we've gone through in our campaign. Same arguments, same pushback from the administration, as Victoria spoke to. And so my question is, one thing we're dealing with now as a campaign is this question about, inside and outside game. And I actually called up Steve Massover, and we had a really great talk after I read his piece in the Daily Kos. And he actually told me about, he was like, get in touch with Gay, because she had a lot of experience. She was like the inside player, like you interfaced with the bureaucracy, so to speak. Victoria's done that, I did that. My question is, how do you, there's a tension there between the folks who want to just like get arrested and escalate and the folks that want to work with the administration. For context, our campaign is, what, 2 years old. Divestment from South Africa has gone on for, you know, it went on for years and years. So I guess my question is, how do you reconcile that tension?
First, I want to thank the panel for such a vivid account of the anti-apartheid movement. It's great to hear, and also the framework and analysis. My name is Gerald Lenoir, and I am with Priority Africa Network here in the Bay Area. I spent many years in Seattle, starting in the mid-'70s in the anti-apartheid movement. I was co-chair of the Seattle Coalition Against Apartheid in the mid-'80s. I moved here in 1986 and joined the Bay Area Free South Africa movement. I just want to make a comment and get some feedback from you all, because the anti-apartheid movement was fueled by what went on in South Africa, and by the very conscious strategy of the ANC, the African National Congress. They had a three-pronged strategy: render South Africa ungovernable and apartheid unworkable, the armed struggle, and international solidarity. And they worked the international solidarity. So from your point of view in the course, how did you interface with the liberation movements? Because in my work, I interfaced a lot and with the ANC and got a real understanding of what was going on the ground and what the strategy was and how we could help support that. So I just wanted to get some feedback on that.
These two also. Okay. There you go. I'm Ann Fagan Ginger of Meiklejohn Civil Liberties Institute and so forth. And I wonder if the speakers are aware that there is a very important organization in the city of Berkeley called the Berkeley Peace and Justice Commission, and that it is important that we all work with the Peace and Justice Commission, because the city of Berkeley in 1990 adopted the UN Charter, Article 50, whatever it is, 55, saying that we will work for human rights for all. And the Peace and Justice Commission has taken a number of steps that I think it would be helpful to always involve them. Also, we're at a moment in history when the United States government, since the 1990s, 1992 and 94, ratified 3 treaties that discuss the very issues you're talking about. So the U.S. President and the Senate agreed to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And so the U.S. government is required to make reports periodically to the UN committees that administer these treaties. And it seems to me that in all the work that you're doing, it would be helpful to make what they call shadow reports, non-governmental organization reports, to the UN committees about the issues you're raising. And it's clear that it has an impact, because when the Human Rights Committee mentioned that the police in New Orleans had shot and killed people who were running away from Katrina, and they made this point, it eventually resulted in a trial of the people who had made that action. It wouldn't have happened without the UN having done that. And the UN committee did it because Meiklejohn Institute sent them a letter. So I would urge you in your thinking to constantly think about the Berkeley Commission on Peace and Justice and the 3 treaties we've ratified. Sorry.
That's great. Thank you very much for your presentations, and I really appreciate your activism. First of all, it's very encouraging that last week the heirs to the Standard Oil, the Rockefeller family, has agreed to divest. And also Tom Steyer, a billionaire in San Francisco, he's agreed to divest, and I know the Cornell University is divesting also. I personally don't have a lot of heroes and heroines. But when I walked into this room, the room lit up for me because of one person being here. And he's such an incredible activist in so many ways. And also, it was a key person at the UC Berkeley in the movement against apartheid. Billy Nesson here. And maybe he could say a few words, or maybe Andrea or somebody could say something about his efforts. Also, Nelson Mandela spoke at the Coliseum and had 60,000 people and was extremely thankful, you know, for the efforts of the longshoremen and people at UC Berkeley and the Bay Area. And so, Billy, would you want to say a few words?
Billy, I'm going to get to you right afterwards, and then you would.
And then there is someone here.
Oh, okay, absolutely. Again, in the interest of brevity, I know it's
Questions.
really tough, but
Questions, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm so glad that you mentioned what's happening on the Oakland ports now. We twice now have stopped the Israeli Zim line from unloading and loading in Oakland, so that was a big victory for the people. And as usual, it was with the cooperation of the longshoremen who have helped so often. I want to make a comment about something else. I was in the free speech movement and the Third World Strike in the 60s here on campus. And you're right about the way that people of color are treated by law enforcement. We had to use different tactics in the Third World Strike than we did in the free speech movement. And one time we got trapped in the basement of Wheeler Hall, and all we could see was the boots of the cops going back and forth. But we took that opportunity to tell each other, among the people of color, what our backgrounds were and why we were there and the histories. And the American Indian who spoke was really marvelous. We learned so much. So we need to keep talking and telling each other about what's happening.
Thank you very much. Ma'am.
My name's Leslie, and I was actually pretty involved in campaign against apartheid. I was an activist for many, many years in many different social justice and environmental movements. And the thing about the anti-apartheid divestment movement on the UC campus, which was different from every other movement that I've been in, is that it seriously moved. And it moved us. And it was an amazing experience to be a part of a group, of a movement that actually had such far-reaching impacts. And I think that the things that Andrea and the other folks up there talked about was that there were people coming from every perspective. There were people who, like us, who were doing the direct action. You know, we were absolutely aware of our white skin privilege on that campus. And we actually, you know, absolutely knew that, you know, United People of Color and other groups couldn't necessarily take the kinds of actions that we could. And we respected the actions that they took, and we felt respected in the actions that we took. And what I want to say is that's how you make a real movement move, is that you let different groups take the tactics that are appropriate for those groups, and you support them in that. So there were people working on the legislative level. There were people working in the streets. There were people working in the boardrooms. There were people working, you know, on every level. And that was amazing. And I also want to say that the university worked really hard to separate us from the community. They created a whole idea of outside agitators. It was huge. They called anybody who came from the community, including like those of us like myself who actually had been a student the semester before, but that semester I wasn't a student, you know. And they did everything they could to divide us. And it's really, really important for those of you who are moving forward in these movements now to make connections in the community, to draw people in together. And I just want to say thank you so much for everybody on the panel.
I'm going to suggest there's a question here. The person
Hi, I'm Billy Nesson. I want to echo what Leslie said and others. I think the way to deal with the inside-outside is to have several groups. There's always going to be many different approaches. The difficulty is how they work together, and that's what we struggled with, and I think that's what every movement has struggled with. That, I think, is probably the most important thing. The other thing I want to mention is we never went back and looked at the regions very carefully and what happened in that vote. But in the years since, I've had occasion to do that. And what I learned is we didn't have to convince all of those conservative regions. In fact, only 2 regions who voted in 1985 against divestment changed their minds in the '86 vote. That was Governor Duke-Majan, and then he had the opportunity to appoint 2 new regions because others were leaving. He picked a fellow Armenian, also against it because of the genocide, supposedly. And then one other region, I think it was Frank Hope. So look carefully, which we didn't do at the regions, and see, can we get 2 or 3? Can we find some way of pressuring them? Don't go after all of them. We won, we lost in '85, I think 14-10 with 2 abstaining. We won the next year by 14 or 13-10 with 2 or 3 abstaining. One last thing, place to look. The Alumni Association, each year it comes up with president and vice president. They are ex officio regents. Those are chosen by each campus, and that rotates. So look also at that, the alumni regents. You can have effect. It's still not clear to me how they get picked, but that's an area of weakness. You can change that. You bring one other person. All you probably need is a few other regions on your side, and you could win that vote.
Thank you very much, Billy. Back here, and then
All right. Oh, me. Oh, okay. My name is Lee Trampleasure. My first activist piece here was in '77 after the Soweto uprisings. A bunch of us took over Sproul Hall. I was a high school student at Berkeley High and happened to come up to campus because I hear there's a protest going on. So that was my first turn-in. But I wanted to say something to the young activists here, first of all. Professor Gitlin talked about a cascade, and that made me realize what's really going on is when we were here, they said, oh, in the biggest protest since the 60s, they kept saying that. I don't know if you hear anything now. I don't know if they're saying in the biggest protest since the anti-Apartheid movement. I don't know if they say that or they still keep going back to the 60s. But what I want you to think about is the movement is like the San Andreas Fault. You cannot stop the San Andreas Fault. You don't know when the earthquake's going to happen. I was involved in a lot of different issues here. You don't know when yours is going to take off. We had a great anti-apartheid movement in '77. It didn't take off as much as in the '80s. So you never know quite when it's going to take off, but you keep working, and every once in a while you get that 8.0 and you just knock the hell out of the institutions.
Hi, I actually have a question for the panel. I'm sorry I missed most of it because I was at work, but I wanted to get opinions. I recognize almost all of you on the panel. I want to know if your opinions about the BDS from Israel, movement on the campuses and the efforts of UC and other colleges across the country to suppress that movement.
What I'd like to do now, I know there's some more hands, but I'd like to go back, and if we don't get chirped out of here at 6 promptly, then I'll reopen for some more questions. But let me go back, maybe just move this way. Sure. You're going to need a minute apiece. Okay, please.
Okay, so Ophir, right? So in terms of inside and outside, I have to say, first of all, I was only inside as a representative of various student groups, so I was never there. When I was in those meetings, it was as a representative of the ASUC or the Graduate Student Union at different times. And the same with I was actually, because of Todd, I was elected to the Harvard Board of Overseers because alumni can be elected. So I spent 6 years, thanks Todd, 6 years serving, felt like a life sentence. But you know what was great about it? Not that I ever felt like I won anything in those settings, but that I kept that conversation going. There's a great set of interviews with corporate executives about what they thought about divestment. By the 1980s, some of them were saying, we're divesting not because we don't think we should be profiting in South Africa, but because it's less than 1% of our business in South Africa and 25% of our board time. It's just too overwhelming. We can't deal with it anymore. So I think you keep them talking, you're keeping them busy. Eventually, you might wear just enough of them down to change the vote, as Billy said, and I think that's what we did inside. I also think we were really good in the movement of having many different tactics always, so many different fronts. For me as an anti-apartheid activist, which is my main, well, I was also a graduate student, but my main concern was that people think about South Africa and keep that discussion going, and that was amazing. Hi, John. It's so nice to see you. Wait, can I say something about BDS? So 10 years ago, I thought it didn't have a prayer of making an impact in the United States, and I think it is now, it's very energetic in Europe. It is changing the discussion around business ties and especially military sales to Israel, and I think that it's likely to start affecting not necessarily corporate behavior in Israel, but it's going to change American politics around Israel, because I think Israeli aggression in Palestine and in the occupied territories has crossed into the abnormal.
You need it all. What we're discussing, the inside-outside, you need multiple allies, and I think around its direct action and other activity, but also you can't always control violence because obviously when the police, if they provoke violence, then that happens, but violence can hurt a movement as much, well, I would just say it can hurt. So structuring as carefully as possible is always useful, but you don't have control over everything. The other issue is for students, I would say that try to make sure to maintain these various things on the campus that give you outlets to do this work. For example, decal and being able to do your independent classes, making sure that the campus continues to allow you to use those kind of units, the 197s, 198s, 199s, right? So important. And then again, multiple allies.
I agree very much with what Gay said around the BDS movement. I think the time is right. And again, when I recall standing there speaking to no one, and then boom, months later, there's thousands of people, and I feel like that's in the air, most definitely. Looking at the support for the blockade of the ships, I mean, that's pretty. There's some impressive frontline resistance happening there. In terms, on that inside-outside question, I think you really have to be clear about what role. The problem, I think, comes when if you're a movement builder, if you're saying that your strategy and your tactic is to disrupt the university and the functioning, so that they have to deal with the issue, you don't want to be caught in a back room somewhere with negotiating, because you're gonna be perceived as betraying your people. You're going to be seen as sharing secrets. Like, we had Fred Gaines played an interesting role. He was the student regent. He wasn't on the front line. He wasn't doing all that. But he wasn't trying to build the solidarity and build the unity that would sustain the direct action aspect. And so it's kind of yeah, you just have to be clear about what roles. We often struggled with that, but I think what they talk about now is diversity of tactics. And there actually is kind of a respect for that, and people seeing that we have those different roles to play. But you can be discredited, and every time I negotiated with the university, I got played, and I felt, they lie and they do co-optation stuff, and they do it on purpose. It's not an accident. They're trying to discredit you, so you're playing with fire if you're in the back room.
A couple quick things. There was always the issue of the media. Just calling a press conference doesn't mean your information is going to get anywhere. And people have to get more sophisticated in how they deal with the media, especially with the BDS issues today. You're going to have to really realize that's a beast and not just a an errand to take care of. It's a beast. And the other thing is when you take on corporate power and then you insert the question of race, then you are really dealing with the fundamentals of our civilization. And that's a healthy thing if you take all that on at once. And people should feel like, this is where we should be going.
Okay, make it fast. On BDS, just where it is amazing right now. When I moved from Beirut to London, I was the only kid who even mentioned Palestinians and would constantly get yelled at. It's totally different now. Say on that. Inside, outside, take it from ACT UP. Leather jackets and suits. You always want to have your demands clear, and you always want to have the suit aspect to be subservient or very, very clearly a part of your organization so that everyone is on the same page about that. And that's basically it. As many tactics as possible and wear them down, because that's what we did and that's what AIDS activists did.
I think the inside-outside question is one of the central ones in social movements. And I think the only thing I can say about it briefly is that I agree with Billy that they should be separately organized, but they also should be mindful of each other, and they should get off their high horses. They should listen. The arguments are very difficult about these matters. And it's important for the inside game people to realize that they actually, since they are staking claim in the possibility of moving insiders, they actually have to deliver on what the insiders do. And the outsiders, since they're laying a claim to both consciousness raising and transformation, can't just say, I want to do this because it makes me feel good. Actually also have to make strategic arguments and assess evidence.
Yeah, so I just wanted to speak real quickly to the things that you all mentioned that we do have. So 25% of their time, we basically lived in the chief investment officer's office this summer. Ophir now works there, and so now has totally been privy to conversations that they're having and how much time this actually is taking. We have a decal. It's new this semester. It's so scary to teach people. So yeah, props to all professors in the room. And we do have some regents on our side, Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom, and then we're also working to build our ties with community allies. We've been trying to do that in the most appropriate way, because I think I've learned a lot in my classes that it's very sometimes it can be problematic to come into a community and try to work with them in ways that are self-serving. So we're really trying to develop those relationships that are mutually beneficial and actually caring about those communities. So we're working with APEN, Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and Communities for a Better Environment in Richmond and Oakland.
All right, thank you.